We're going to start with a prayer, and this prayer is at the top of the screen. It's on the screen. It's also at the top of your handout. It's the prayer we've prayed the last several weeks, though I've changed the language to reflect the fact that General Convention is taking place even now. Let's offer that prayer out loud together. Almighty and everlasting Father, you have given the Holy Spirit to abide with us forever. Bless, we pray, with his grace and presence, the bishops and the other clergy and the laity now assembled in your name, that your church, being preserved in true faith and godly discipline, may fulfill all the mind of him who loved it and gave himself for it, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So it's been a 4-week series, which is a fairly significant series in any case. But it's been a fairly intensive look at General Convention. Let me just remind you a little bit about how we've looked at it. I will not repeat what we've talked about the previous 3 weeks. The first week we talked about what is General Convention, how does it work, and we looked in detail at the legislative process, where resolutions come from, how they are debated and considered, and how they passed. Then in the 2 weeks that followed, we looked at particular kinds of resolutions. The first week we looked at what I called liturgical developments, which usually get most of our attention because they tinker with things like our prayers and our worship. But there are lots of other issues, and last week we looked at those, and we only scratched the surface. As a reminder, you can find all of the resolutions online. You can read them, you can study them, inwardly mark, learn, and digest them in order to sort of know what's going on at General Convention. Today we're talking about the topic that I think gets the most attention when there is a presiding bishop election, which of course is the election of the presiding bishop. As I advertised last week, I've got some inflammatory comments to make about that, but I'll save them towards the end. Before we get to our introductory questions, would somebody be willing to run the microphone around the room for us so that people who are... Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Thank you. I have not turned that on yet. So let's start with the introductory questions on your handout, and also I'll pull them up on the screen. And let's start with who our current presiding bishop is, Michael Curry. We've been praying for Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, for 9 years. He's not finished yet. He's got until the end of October as our presiding bishop. But let's start. What's your impression of Michael Curry's tenure as presiding bishop? How would you describe it? How would you characterize it? How would you characterize your experience of it? How would you describe Michael Curry's 9-year tenure as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church? Elizabeth?
High visibility for the Episcopal Church and lots of energy.
High visibility, lots of energy. Thank you. How else would you describe Michael Curry's tenure? Yeah, Emily up front.
I think we touched on it last week when you said he has had a tenure of love, which is true.
Yeah.
And I have had personal experience with him, with that love and care that he has for the person that he's directly speaking with and for the community at large.
Yeah.
It's just been a caring, loving tenure that he's had.
Yeah, caring and loving. Thank you. How else would you characterize Michael Curry's tenure as presiding bishop? Is there a moment from his tenure that sticks out to you? Is there for me, it was the marriage of Harry and Meghan Markle, right? He was the preacher at Westminster Abbey when Prince Harry was married, and brought a little bit of the sort of the fervor and energy, not only of his particular preaching and of the Episcopal Church, but of the Black Church. Which he ran way over the camera crew and the tightly orchestrated wedding. There was some frustration with how long he went, but you might remember that after that he made such an impression that he did the circuit, like he was on the Today Show. A couple days later. Anyway, so he very visible, but that was sort of a quintessential moment. The other thing the other moment that I would remember that for me is emblematic of a certain part of his tenure was the ordination of our bishop, John Harmon. Do you remember, if you were there in person or if you watched online, do you remember how at the beginning of the sermon, Nathan Baxter asked us all to hold in prayer Michael Curry. Michael Curry, the presiding bishop, would normally be present and the chief consecrator at all bishops' ordinations, but he couldn't be there because he'd had another fall, right? And he was undergoing surgery at that moment. And in the silence of that moment, his executive assistant who was with us got word that the surgery had gone successfully, and so we kind of erupted in some joy at the end of that time of silence. I would describe Michael Curry's tenure as being consistently one of health concerns. He's had a lot of health concerns, heart concerns, brain concerns, fall concerns, and his ability to kind of do the demanding parts of the job were in some ways compromised because of that. But I'm thankful, of course, that he's finished strong. But that's been hard. And I remember a couple of times our bishop, not John, but Larry, saying, bishops have no idea what's going on. No one will tell us how he's doing. We hear he's ill, but we don't know. Which is just interesting, isn't it? To be in that kind of close connection with someone and not be able to know how they are. All right, second question. Since you're in charge of picking our next presiding bishop, you're not, I'm not. But if you were, what would you say are the most important characteristics in your mind for our next presiding bishop? What are the qualities, characteristics, gifts, charisms? What would you say is most important for our next presiding bishop as you see it? What do you think? Raise your hand and Bill will bring you the microphone. Yeah, Ray? And then Dave?
Distinguishing covenant theology from dispensational theology and drawing the political implications therefrom.
Thank you. I appreciate you articulating what is surely a wide-held position. No, it's very important, but I'm not sure anybody would have phrased it quite like that. Yes?
Being able to help a lot of people who have different views listen to each other.
Yeah, say yes. Yeah, yes. Thank you. Another way to say it, yes.
I know it's kind of hard to be charismatic and have administrative skills, but it sounds like our next bishop needs to be kind of strong in that area because maybe that's been a weakness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Curry's reign.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe administrative and charismatic. I hear you naming both of those things. Yeah. Richard.
My characteristic is related to those. I think he needs strong leadership.
Strong
Or
leadership.
She needs strong
Yep.
leadership skills
Yeah.
based in love.
Strong leadership. What else? Yeah, Justin.
Not as articulately said, but backbone.
Backbone.
The world is changing. Christianity is at debate on how it's going to proceed forward, and someone who's going to have a firm opinion and be willing to proclaim it.
Yeah, thank you. In the Diocese of Arkansas, we have experienced the pendulum swings of the different kinds of bishops that one can have. Our current bishop, John Harmon, is a visionary. He is not an administrator. Ask anybody who's had to wait on him to return a phone call, an email, or to show up for a meeting. That's not his gift. That's not his gift. He needs strong support in that way. Larry Benfield, excellent administrator, not a visionary in that sense. Articulate a vision through structure and organization, but not that kind of warm and charismatic figure. Larry Mays, the other side of that. Larry Mays was not a particularly great administrator, but was warm and had a wonderful presence. I'm told that Donovan before him, Bishop Donovan, not very warm, a banker, right? You just sort of, anyway. So it's just funny how communities seem to know what they need, but often we end up moving back and forth. If you've never read it, it's worth a read. It's called Sustainable Youth Ministry. It's a book by Mark DeVries. It's a book about basically how can a church build a youth program that is sustainable for the long term. And the first thing it tries to convince a church to do is not to hire Jesus to be their next youth minister. We don't need Jesus. We need a youth minister, but we need to remember that the youth minister can't do everything. Some youth ministers are the organizers, the behind-the-scenes connectors. But if that's the youth minister's gift, then we're going to need volunteers who are good with youth, face-to-face. And that's a model of doing it. The other model is, let's find a youth minister who's great at relating to youth, but we need to recognize that we're going to have to support that person by doing the organization, the communication, the shopping, and the like, right? And when a church begins to realize that no one has all the gifts, not even Jesus, has all the gifts needed for youth ministry or being a rector or a children's minister or a choir director or a presiding bishop, when we realize that nobody has all of those gifts and we can figure out who we are and what we need, then we can also figure out how to support that person in other ways, usually. I think there's a challenge when it's the presiding bishop. I think it's really hard for a church which has developed some official roles and duties through accretion, sort of over time, to kind of stop and say, maybe the presiding bishop doesn't need to be the one doing that. And it's hard, and we'll look at some of that today. So today we're going to look at presiding bishop. I hope that I'll be able to show at least snippets of the videos of the 5 candidates. So hold on and stay tuned for that. So look at your handout, look at the screen. There was a profile. Anytime there's a rector search or a bishop search, there's a profile. So the Joint Standing Commission for the Nomination of a Presiding Bishop, on which Thomas Alexander, a recently ordained priest in our diocese, is a member. That commission surveyed the entire Episcopal Church, asked what we want for a presiding bishop, and then put together a profile. You can find the profile online. I responded to the survey. Did anybody else in the room respond to the survey? It's the kind of thing that why would anybody respond to the survey? Anyway, I responded to the survey. 6,000 apparently responses to the survey. And this is what came out of it. These 4 sections, more or less. First, they named, we need a presiding bishop who reflects the world that we live in. And they named 3 central challenges in the world that we live in: environmental crisis, violence, conflict, and war, inequality, and division. And it is in direct response to that experience of the world that we are calling someone to serve as presiding bishop. We also need a presiding bishop who reflects the challenges of today's church, the challenge of the need for evangelism, the need for catechesis, the need for nurturing our own faith and adapting to our current reality. We need a presiding bishop who can meet those challenges. The qualities and characteristics of the presiding bishop, there's a long list in the profile, but they named these 3 as central characteristics for our next presiding bishop. Strong leadership, we heard that in our room. Love of preaching and communicating that public vision, and faithfulness. We need a presiding bishop who is personally faithful and can invite us to be faithful from that place. And then, of course, they reminded us, and I'll show you more about this on the next page, that there are very clearly defined requirements and roles for the presiding bishop. Any bishop can be elected. Doesn't matter how long they've been a bishop. Any bishop can be elected. It is for a 9-year term. All clergy, including bishops in the Episcopal Church, have to retire at the age of 72, which means that the presiding bishop, if they turned 72 during the 9-year tenure, would have to retire at the previous convention, which means nominees have to be less than 72 minus 9, is essentially what that means. And then, as you'll see on the next page, there are lots of very carefully defined roles and functions. Take a look at that list. Let's let somebody other than me read some of these lists. Who would read for us, please, the first half of those, all the way down through the sub-bullets under various responsibilities in peculiar situations? Who would read that bit for us, please? Thank you. And Karen, would you pick up, Ray, would you pick up next with specific roles and read the rest for us? Thank you.
Roles and functions of presiding bishop. Provide leadership in developing policies and strategies for the church and speaking for the church on the policies, strategies, and programs of General Convention. Visit every diocese of the Episcopal Church. That's a canon. Speak God's words to the church and to the world as the representative of this church.
Would you hold that microphone a little closer to your mouth, please? Thank you.
Represent the Episcopal Church in the Anglican Communion as primate. Participate in the ordination and consecration of bishops. Preside over the House of Bishops. various responsibilities in peculiar situations, congregations in foreign lands, including Micronesia and the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe, the consent process upon the election of bishops, members of religious orders and Christian communities, the Episcopal Church in Navajo land, federal chaplaincies and the bishop for federal ministries, dioceses without bishops.
Thank you. Ray, would you take over for us?
Specific roles in the disciplinary process. Receives requests from bishops for release and removal from the ministry of the Episcopal Church. Receives resignations of bishops. Receives evidence of the incapacity of bishops. Issues pastoral directions, restrictions on ministry, and administrative leaves to bishops. Appoints the intake officer for complaints against bishops. Serves on the reference panel of the disciplinary board for bishops. Certifies abandonment of communion by bishops. Processes charges of violations of doctrine by bishops. Has a significant role in proceedings to terminate the relationship of a bishop and a diocese. Next heading, important roles in governance and as an executive. Appointments to many bodies. Joint appointments with PHOD, and could you tell me what that is?
President of the House of Deputies.
Very good. Member of committees and commissions. Chair and president of governing boards. Chief executive officer of executive council. Manage presiding bishop's staff. Speak and preach around the world. Lead various organizations, example ER&D. What's that?
Episcopal Relief and Development.
Okay, and College for Bishops.
Thank you. Is there anything on that long list that surprises you? That you thought, I had no idea the presiding bishop was supposed to do that. Anything surprise you on that list? Yeah, Karen.
It surprises me, but maybe I don't know what it means. Certifies abandonment of communion by bishops.
Yeah, so if a bishop leaves the auspices, the participation in the church. So like if Larry Benfield, now that he's retired, resigned, became Roman Catholic, then we would say he's left our communion. He's abandoned our communion. Yeah. What else do you notice? What else surprises you? Elizabeth, and then Ryan.
The appointment of the intake officer for complaints against the bishops, that seems kind of like a conflict of interest.
Yeah, interesting. There's actually a proposal to change how we do that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Ryan.
Dioceses without bishops, is that just in case of illness or, incapacitation?
Sometimes it is, but
long-standing...
Sometimes it is, but often bishops will resign or retire or die or sometimes be removed from office before an election has happened. So Larry Benfield finished his term the day that John Harmon began, but often there are dioceses that don't have a bishop. And when you don't have a bishop, the standing committee is what's known as the ecclesiastical authority, but they can only do so much because they're not bishops. So the presiding bishop has to have an episcopal authority because I can't do what I do unless we have some bishop overseeing us. My ministry is essentially the physical presence of a bishop's ministry in the church. I have to have an overseer. Side note, that's one of the reasons that same-sex marriage was such a challenge in dioceses where bishops would not approve it, because priests can't offer it without the direct supervision of a bishop. Our church doesn't allow, not just because you have to approve, but like I can't do what I do without some bishop, my ministry being essentially an extension of that bishop's ministry. And so whenever there's an absence, the presiding bishop has to offer that, even if the presiding bishop doesn't have a lot to do with day-to-day operations of a diocese. That would be the standing committee, yeah. Other things that surprised you on that list? Yeah, Bill.
I'm surprised how much he has to do and how he can find the time to do all this.
Yeah. It's a long list. It's a hard job. And did you notice how many of those things sound like things that only the presiding bishop can do? Some of them are things that he shares, right, or she shares, right? Speak and preach around the world. There are other people who can represent the Episcopal Church, but nobody else can represent us as a primate, right? Nobody can fill those particular roles in the disciplinary process. Although maybe those various responsibilities in peculiar situations could be in some way shared, a lot of these are kind of the part and parcel of the work and ministry of the presiding bishop. It's a lot, a whole lot. Also recognize, particularly in these executive functions, I would say these two things are really significant. The presiding bishop is responsible for deciding which bishop sits on the standing commission that is dealing with liturgical reform and renewal. Nobody else gets to decide what bishop sits there. That means if the presiding bishop doesn't like contemporary reform to liturgy, the presiding bishop can stack that commission with a bunch of recalcitrant, not moving forward people, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, right? Except the president of the House of Deputies, who appoints the lay and clergy representatives, who might be able to do that, but it's an equal appointment. So imagine how much authority is given to the presiding bishop for those appointments. The joint appointments with the PHOD are things like Secretary of General Convention. They have to share those responsibilities. And as we talked about a while back when we looked at what's the big deal with bishops, we as a church historically have been skeptical of bishops' authority, right? We don't like it when one person gets to make all the decisions. We are a bottom-up church. We're a democratic church. The role of the presiding bishop has changed radically over the history of the Episcopal Church. It used to be that the presiding bishop, the only job of the presiding bishop, was to chair the meeting when all the bishops came together. That was it. They were president of the House of Bishops. They still are. But they didn't have, there was no primate. There's no appointments to, committees and boards. There's, we didn't even have a disciplinary structure, right? Thankfully, we do. But the only job of the presiding bishop was to kind of, bring the group together and say, all right, be quiet. Let's give this person a chance to talk, and this person a chance to talk. So much more has grown as we've become a part of an international community, the Anglican Communion, as the Episcopal Church has become sophisticated, right? There are lots of reasons that we need a presiding bishop to do all these things, and yet those accretions have happened over time and have changed the way a presiding bishop functions and also the way that one is chosen. Ray?
Well, it seems like you're saying the presiding bishop has more power than they used to because of all these pressing administrative functions that haven't found someone else to do them.
Yeah, I think so. I think the presiding bishop does have far more power. Some of that is an official authority, like the appointment of those boards. But also a lot of that is about the representative, the representational authority. Until, I don't have the date, I should have looked it up, but until not that long ago, the presiding bishop remained bishop of their diocese. So we wouldn't care if the Bishop of Ohio is convening the meetings. The Bishop of Ohio doesn't get to speak for us, right? Gets to call to order the House of Bishops. But the presiding bishop isn't our bishop. It's just another bishop who happens to be the chairman of this committee called the House of Bishops. Now there's this thing called primatial authority, a metropolitan, someone who, like the figurehead or leader of the Church of England, the Church of Wales, the Episcopal Church in Scotland, this church and that church, begins to represent the entire institution and denomination to the world. We need a presiding bishop who does that, but we still hold on to some of the old mechanisms for choosing a presiding bishop, identifying a presiding bishop, and supporting a presiding bishop that either inhibit or overly burden someone who is speaking on behalf of the whole church. Do we want someone to speak on behalf of the church, or do we want someone to be a presiding officer of one half of General Convention and all that comes with it? That's hard. Yeah, Ray, follow up.
What's the difference between a presiding bishop and the Archbishop of Canterbury?
That's kind of like asking what's the difference between the governor of Arkansas and the governor of the county in England. I don't know. They both are primates, right? So they've been chosen in their own respective ways, different ways. They've been chosen to be a primate. The Archbishop of Canterbury is first and foremost the Bishop of Canterbury, but also the primate for all England. York is England, and it's a complicated historical bit. But the Archbishop of Canterbury has no official authority in the Episcopal Church, just as the presiding bishop has no official authority in the Church of England. But when the Archbishop of Canterbury speaks, we all kind of listen and say, "Oh, Justin Welby, that's important." Could you have named Justin Welby as the Archbishop of Canterbury? Many of you are like, I don't know, but we can all name who the Pope is, right? Isn't that funny? A church of not Catholics can name the Pope's name more easily than we can name the Archbishop of Canterbury's name, which is actually demonstrative. The Archbishop of Canterbury has zero authority in our church, right? So they're similar. They fill a similar role, but in a different, not only in a different place, but I think more importantly in a different structure. The primus is the title for the metropolitan, the primate of the Episcopal Church in Scotland. And they're a lot like us. They're suspicious of that. So the primus is, doesn't really speak with that kind of authority. And one of the challenges is when you get a bunch of different national or international groups together, and some of them have primates as their leaders, and others just have the president of the House of Bishops. One person has the authority to speak on behalf of the church, and others are like, can't do it, it's not my job. And so we've needed a presiding bishop who can speak with authority, even if the structure hasn't really allowed it. It's really confusing. And you're starting to hear a little bit of my inflammatory comments, but you'll hear them even more directly when we get to the end. Thoughts about anything about the role of the presiding bishop? Yeah, Elizabeth and then Ryan.
So I have a question. So the balance of power for the bishop, if, he's running rogue or whatever, is the president of the committee of bishops? Is that the balance of power?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, it's, if, that list of roles in the disciplinary process, right? So if John Harmon did something wrong, then there would be a complaint against him in the disciplinary process. And there's a very carefully defined disciplinary process. And the presiding bishop doesn't get to make the decision. There's a process. So the intake officer receives the complaint, investigates whether, if true, the complaint would would constitute a violation. Then there's an investigation done. It's referred to a panel. So there are lots of processes, steps in the process. The presiding bishop has some role in the steps of the process, but the presiding bishop in particular is not the check on that authority. The presiding bishop doesn't have any authority in Arkansas except what authority is given to the presiding bishop. Right? The presiding bishop can't decide any more than the Bishop of Connecticut about what our worship looks like. The General Convention can, right? Yeah. And the presiding bishop surely has a role not only as the president of the House of Bishops, but also as the one who appoints people to these bodies and as the one who governs debate. Certainly can manipulate that to some extent. So I wouldn't say that we are completely removed from the influence of the presiding bishop, but the presiding bishop is not a pope, not authority. Really, in many ways, is just the president of the House of Bishops and is co-equal with the president of the House of Deputies. Those are co-equal. We don't mention Julia by name in our prayers every week, but we could. We pray for Michael, our presiding bishop. Maybe we should pray for Julia, the president of the House of Deputies. But we're not going to do that. But we could. And in terms of governance, when you get to General Convention, people get really, really rigid about who gets to do what. Because most of the time in the church, a bishop walks in, everybody says, "Oh, a bishop." At General Convention, people are like, "I don't care. He's not in charge. We're in charge. We're in charge. The deputies are in charge. We're in charge of the House of Deputies. They're in charge of their house." They came second. We were first. Right? They needed us to decide that we're going to have bishops. And there's this kind of, almost diffidence that sometimes underscores that. Yeah, Ryan.
Last question for me, I promise.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Ask as many as you want. They're good.
The point about appointing people to specific commissions and other bodies, does that change every night? Is it a whole sea change every 9 years, whole new group of people, or is it staggered?
Every 3 years it will change.
Okay.
So every task force or other groups, they're what are often or used to be called interim bodies, the groups that carry out the work of convention in between conventions, and those get staffed. Only 3 standing commissions are understood to exist kind of in perpetuity. There's always debate about should we have more or fewer. Then there are lots of other interim bodies appointed every general convention. Often, the same people will get appointed triennium after triennium because they've got experience, they've got knowledge, and they're experts in their field, but sometimes it changes. I used to get appointed to those things when I was buddies with the president of the House of Deputies. I'm not buddies with the president of the House of Deputies anymore. I don't get appointed to those things anymore. That's been a change. Yeah. Marion, right behind you.
You may have covered this already because I just came in.
That's okay.
But I've been reading about the General Convention, and I was wondering if you could explain the Title IV disciplinary action that are attached to the 3 of the bishops that are going for presiding bishop.
Yeah, I'll mention that Episcopal News Service published an article a couple of weeks ago, mid-June, early June, that 3 of the candidates for presiding bishop have or are facing Title IV disciplinary actions. And it detailed the nature of the actions. Rob Wright, Bishop of Atlanta, was accused of mismanagement by a friend of our church, Catherine Meeks, the former executive director of the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta, because apparently it was alleged that Rob Wright either stopped the process for a search or continued, and she didn't like it, so she alleged a complaint, and it was kind of found to be, there was no standing for her complaint. I think she was really disappointed with how he did it, and so she filed a complaint and it didn't go anywhere. There was one for Dee Dee Duncan Proby about whether her doctorate that she claims is a real doctorate, and she kind of addressed that publicly. There was a claim, 2 claims against Daniel Gutierrez, one active, one formerly active. I can't remember the nature of it. One was about how they handled an allegation about clergy misconduct in a previous setting. If you're curious, there are multiple outstanding Title IV claims against our current presiding bishop, Michael Curry. That just it just kind of happens, and I think the Joint Standing Commission or the presiding bishop's office, I'm not sure which one, decided that it would be better to release that information that normally wouldn't be released because it's such a public time in the process. You're welcome. All right, let's look at the candidates. There are 5 candidates, 4 of whom were, this is not on your, it was going to be a third page for like a couple of lines, so I just decided I wouldn't put it on the page. So these are the 5 candidates. The first 4 are those who were nominated by the Joint Standing Commission for the nomination of presiding bishop. And as the process happens, after they nominated these 4, there was a petition process, and 1 candidate was included in the petition process, the Right Reverend Dee Dee Duncan Proby. And so you'll see that we've got Nebraska, Pennsylvania, Northwestern Pennsylvania, Western New York, Atlanta, and Central New York. I personally I've spent time with several of them. I probably know Bishop Gutierrez the best of them. He would tell you that he saved my life one day, and that's probably an exaggeration of the story, but I'd let him tell it because he's a candidate for presiding bishop. But anyway, I know Dee Dee Duncan Proby from a conference. I've been at a conference where Rob Wright spoke. I don't know Scott Barker at all. I've met Sean Rowe, but don't know him particularly well. But these are the candidates for presiding bishop. Let's listen to the opening line. So all of the candidates, they had a lot of materials to provide. And one of the pieces of material is a video asking them to name what biblical image speaks to them and to the Episcopal Church as they understand it at this time in the life of the church. And we won't listen to the whole, we don't have 25 minutes to listen to all of them, but let's listen to at least each of them name what their particular issue is. If you're watching online, I want you to know that these videos are distributed through YouTube, which means that almost certainly as soon as I play it, the screen is going to go dark because YouTube doesn't realize that we have the permission to air these videos. So if you're watching online, hang on. We'll be back in just a few moments. So we'll start with Scott Barker.
Scott Barker, presently serving as the Bishop of the Diocese of Nebraska. I'm answering personal reflection question number 10. Tell us about a biblical image or metaphor that resonates with this moment in the life of the church and the role of the presiding bishop. Gosh, there's so many beautiful Bible stories that would work to answer this question, and I've run through countless possibilities in my head. But I keep coming back to what I think is probably the central metaphor of the entire Christian endeavor, which is the idea of carrying the cross of Jesus. I'm drawn to the image of the cross, first of all, because it centers Jesus in this conversation and this moment. Before we can talk about taking up our cross, we have to talk about the cross and the fact that that reminds us of the person of Jesus and his sacrifice that saved humankind and continues to be the heart of the gospel that we preach.
If you want to see more, just Google nominees for presiding bishop, and I promise that you will find this page. Next, Daniel Gutierrez. Let's hear from Daniel Gutierrez.
It has to be the woman at the well. Jesus is always teaching us. We know the Samaritans and Jews despise one another. The apostles warned Jesus not to go through Samaria. Yet Jesus goes, and he goes alone.
We're going to stop there. I really just want to hear what image they choose. Sean Rowe, you'll see he's bishop of 2 different dioceses, which is unusual. Here we go. Let's listen to Sean Rowe.
The last chapter of Luke's gospel, we catch 2 of Jesus' followers in the act of missing the point, which is, if you've read this far into the gospels, you know is practically their vocation. They are professionals at being confused. They have a gift of never understanding what is happening, and their story is one of my favorite ways of talking about where we find ourselves in the Episcopal Church today. In Luke 24, it's just a few hours after the women went to the tomb and found that the body of Jesus was not there. And so instead of staying to find out what's going on, to check out the story, Cleopas and his companion decide to make their way out of Jerusalem. They're headed the wrong way, out of Jerusalem, away from disciples, away from the women who had been the last pastors and protectors at the cross and the first ones at the empty tomb.
All right, that's Sean Rowe. Let's listen to Rob Wright. I'll remember to turn on the captions this time. Here's Rob Wright.
The biblical image that resonates with me at this moment in the life of the church comes from the 18th chapter of the prophet Jeremiah. It's the image of the potter and the clay. We see this image also in Isaiah 45 and in the 9th chapter of Romans. But I like the way Jeremiah presents it. Jeremiah, the prophet who God shows the reality of how Lamentations and Life Abundant live side by side. Jeremiah hears an invitation from God to go down to the potter's house to get a word for God's people. So he gets there and he sees the potter at the wheel working the clay. And he watches the potter remake the clay. The clay is being reworked because the Bible says it was marred. That is...
All right, that's Rob Wright. And last, Didi Duncan Proby.
At this time in the Episcopal Church, the biblical imagery that speaks to me, especially as we're discerning our next presiding bishop, is from John 4 and 5, Jesus' encounter of the woman at the well. A woman who has suffered and who is part of the diaspora, who has gone to the well seeking water, a source of life. And she encounters Jesus, the ultimate source of life. When we read...
All right. There's more, of course, to hear, and you might be interested in hearing those. Anything in particular catch your attention as you heard those videos? What leaves an impression with you? What's interesting to you about that? There's obviously more to read, and we didn't have listen to. There's more, but of what you heard, what seemed interesting to you? Yeah, Ray, right in front of you. Yep.
Bishop Gutierrez was unafraid to confront contemporary political problems.
Thank you. What else? What else? Yeah, Richard.
From the prophet Jeremiah, the image of the potter reworking clay there was something wrong and it didn't come out well, so he's taking it back and remolding it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What else seems interesting? David, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, the one who talked about the road to Emmaus, or the road to Emmaus and the church going the wrong direction seems controversial and complicated.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
I think it's interesting that 2 of them chose the woman at the well.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? All right, let me ask you some questions, then I'll give you some feedback. Presiding Bishop election quiz. Who nominates candidates for the presiding bishop? It's the Joint Standing Commission for the nomination of a presiding bishop. They're the ones who officially nominate people, which it's a joint standing commission made up of bishops, priests, deacons, and lay people. That's the significant part. But here's the bit that I want you to know. Who votes in the election of a presiding bishop? Do you know? Bishops. Only bishops. You don't get a say. I don't get a say. Our deputies don't get a say. We do not get a vote in who our next primate will be. Think about what it would feel like in Arkansas. If I said, we're going to have a new bishop, but lay people don't get to vote. Just the clergy. We'll take care of it. We'll tell you who your next bishop's going to be. I'd be furious. I get angry every 9 years that we have this process. I get really angry. This will be the 4th presiding bishop I've served as a priest under the tenure. The 3rd time I've been active during an election. And every time I get so angry that the bishops are choosing not only the president of their house, which is certainly reasonable, but they're choosing a primate, someone who has been given the authority to speak on your behalf, and you get 0 say in it. I get really angry about that. I think it's wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong. And because of that, I was committed to voting no. Whenever the bishops came and said, this is the person we've chosen, will you say yes? And the answer is always yes. That's the last question. What role do they play in the election? They have a chance to say no. If the bishops choose someone that the deputies refuse to have, we get to say no, try again. But they can choose the same person again, and it's never happened. It's never going to happen. But I'm committed to voting no. I'm committed to voting no, no matter how good that person is, no matter how much I think that person is the best choice, because I think in our church, the structure of our church demands that all of us have a say in who gets chosen as our presiding bishop, not president of the House of Bishops. If you want to remove all of the primatial identity, if you want to ask the presiding bishop no longer to represent the Episcopal Church, absolutely, go for it, bishops. You can choose your own president. But when it comes to a primate, I think that's a terrible mistake. Sarah. I'm sure you can tell I feel strongly about this. Yeah, Sarah.
Preach.
Yeah.
Has it always been that way was my question.
Always. Because it used to just be the president of the House of Bishops. And as long as it was just the guy back then, who would gather that group together, nobody else cared, right? It doesn't bother me whatever you want to have for supper tonight. Like, you eat whatever you want or don't eat at all. I trust that you will have a meal that you choose or no meal at all. It's none of my business. I don't care who they choose as their presiding officer. But when it comes to someone who's going to have more authority than the president of the House of Deputies, someone who is able to represent us on the global stage, like, I think we need to have a voice in that. The argument is that we do have a voice in terms of the development of the profile and the submission of the nominees. And so that's different. That has grown. That has developed. The fact that there's a joint standing commission for the nomination is helpful. But I always get frustrated because it seems to me to be a betrayal of our church's identity. And because of the steady snowballing effect of the authority. But of course the bishops aren't going to share that election with lowly deputies. Why would they, right? But it's a significant thing. It's a significant manifestation of who we are as a church. And I think it's a shame that we haven't done that. I always grouse about it. Nobody cares. Nobody at convention cares. I always write blog posts and get really frustrated about it, but nobody cares. But that's okay. But it's my sort of, it's the burr in my saddle, if you will. All right, so that's my inflammatory comments. I would vote no. I would encourage people to vote no because I think something has to change. Let me say one more thing about my inflammatory comments. A lot of people are just appalled at how much money the president of the House of Deputies makes. That's only been a salaried position for 3 years. Used to be a volunteer position. Imagine the president of the House of Deputies having to make all those joint appointments, having to show up to all of those meetings and not being paid to do it. All it meant was that he was somebody rich or somebody retired. Usually both, right? Now we have a salary, and the church is rightly dismayed. It's something like $240,000. It's a lot of money. How much that person gets paid, I'm all for it, as long as the presiding bishop is also getting paid for that work. Not because I think it's a good use of our money, but because I think equity matters. And if the laity and the clergy are going to be represented by a volunteer, and the bishops are going to be represented by somebody who gets paid $350,000 or whatever it is to do that job, I don't know how much it is, then of course we're going to be less important. Of course we're going to be, our voice isn't going to matter. So I think that's another way that people are sometimes surprised at my absolute belief that the president of the House of Deputies should get paid a lot of money, because the presiding bishop does too. Or the presiding bishop should become a volunteer, and then I absolutely think that the PHOD should also be a volunteer. That's my point. So, all right, let me move back to the candidates for presiding bishop. I texted a few colleagues of mine to ask them who they think will be elected. And all of the responses I got was that Sean Rowe has it in the bag. Like, it's done. Now, I'll warn you that I have long since given up forecasting bishops' elections because whoever I think is going to win almost always loses. And I don't pick the one I want to win. I pick the one I think is going to win, and apparently I can't read the electorate very well. There's not valid polling data for this. But Sean Rowe seems to be, among the people I've asked, seems to be in the lead. I would have guessed that Rob Wright would have been the favorite, given that he's a clear and important prophetic voice in the House of Bishops and has been for a long time. Daniel Gutierrez has been trying really hard to get elected. He's had a social media campaign for about 3 years, highlighting all the successes that he's had as a bishop. It's been very easy to see. Scott Barker, I don't know at all. Dee Dee Duncan-Proby, I think in large part because she's a woman. I think it's important that we have women in positions of leadership. I think she is absolutely a contender. But when you get nominated through the petition process instead of through the normal kind of the committee that did all the research, it'll tell you something about the fact that she wasn't included the first time around. So if I were a betting person, only because of those two responses, I think Sean Rowe is a pretty likely candidate. He's been a bishop for a really long time. He's pretty young. He's pretty good in terms of it being an administrator. But the one thing I will say about bishops is the House of Bishops knows who they need. They might not know who we need, but they know who they need. The House of Bishops knows who they need to be the next presiding bishop. They know these individuals. They know them pretty well. They've heard them speak a lot. They spend a lot of time together. They know what it's like to have this individual in a position of leadership. So they will choose whomever they know that the House of Bishops needs in this role. It'll be up to us to kind of receive that and celebrate it. That election, I believe, is on Thursday of this week. Might be Wednesday or Thursday of this week. So next Sunday in church, we will pray for Michael, our presiding bishop, and blank, our presiding bishop-elect. And we will continue to pray for Michael and whoever that presiding bishop-elect is until the end of October. November 1st is when the new presiding bishop takes office and Michael Curry retires from that post. Questions, comments, observations? Yeah, Gabi, here comes that microphone.
Please help me understand, do those candidates run their own advertising campaign on social media?
Yeah, there isn't real, nothing official. Yeah, nothing official.
But social media is reaching out whether it's official or not.
Sure, but,
so are they?
None of them has, to my knowledge, had any posts about why they should be elected. That is not it. But I've noticed that Bishop Gutierrez, for about 3 years, has had lots of videos about churches that he's planted or ministries with children or outreach trips or missionary outings or that kind of stuff. So he's been very visible on social media. None of the others seems to come across my feed. I encounter Rob Wright because he's a prophetic voice in the church, but I wouldn't say any of the others is someone that I've kind of encountered out in the world. Yeah. What else? Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Justin. Ray and then Justin. Start with Ray.
Your concerns about the lack of democratic process, would you be considered an innovator in terms of church polity, or do you have a traditional store of authority to draw on to support your position?
I would say, as we discussed in the sort of what's the deal with bishops in that class, like I think the history of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America would absolutely suggest that it is fundamentally contrary to who we've always been, that we would have a primate who's elected only by bishops. I bet that of the people who go to General Convention, 90% of them would agree with that because they would say, yeah, but 85% of them would say, I don't really care. Right, yeah. Oh, I'm not the only person who cares about this, but I'm one of the only ones who makes a big deal about it. Yeah, yeah. But I would say, no, I'm not an innovator on that. I'm a recalcitrant historian. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Justin.
Understanding the mandatory retirement age, is there any policy around reelection of a presiding
Oh, no,
bishop?
there have been reelected presiding bishops. Yeah. It's hard to imagine these days anybody wanting to do that more than 9 years. But yeah, absolutely. And there was at one point, one of the candidates, not this time, although Sean Rowe might be young enough, but one of the candidates, it was like we all kind of realized, oh, Catherine Jefferts Schori, she could have run for 9 more years. She did not want to run for 9 more years. And she probably wouldn't have been elected if she had run. That might be why she didn't run. Yeah. So no, there's no policy. Yeah, you can get elected again. Absolutely. In fact, in the old days, the presiding bishop was just the longest serving bishop. And they served until they died. And then whoever was next on the ladder stepped up. So, because again, it was just somebody to get the group together, right? So, no prohibitions. All right, thank y'all. Pray for General Convention. Our deputies are there now. They're probably worshiping now, getting ready for General Convention. Meetings have started. Committees have started. Pray for our deputation, our lay and clergy deputation, as well as our bishop, and maybe the retired bishops who are probably there, but I'm not sure about that. Pray for them as they do the work of the church. Thank you all so much. Next week, during the Adult Forum, we'll have a panel of members of the queer community who are going to talk to us about what St. Paul's has meant to them and about our relationship with pride. I hope you'll be there. Thanks.